The platform at Howrah station is always loud, always full. It crackles with the sound of steel, hurried footsteps, impatient whistles, a tide of bodies that moves without noticing the details. And on most days, those details don't matter. But every so often, something moves within that noise. Something evil, something darker. On a cold November afternoon in 1933, a young heir passed through that tide. Surrounded by family on his way home to a princely estate, he walked, as so many around him did. And like so many others, he might have forgotten the bump of a shoulder, the brush of a sleeve, the feeling of a moment too fast to register. Except he didn't. Because that day, that brush, that fleeting second, it left behind something no one could see. Something that would turn a routine train journey into one of the most unbelievable crime stories of pre-independent India. A murder carried out in plain sight, a weapon no one could detect, and a conspiracy so intricate, even history nearly forgot it. This is the story of Amarendra Chandra Pandey. Hi everyone, welcome to the Desi Crime Podcast, a show where we dive deep into some of the craziest cases from around South Asia. I'm your host Aishwarya.
And I'm Aryan.
And the case that I have for you today is so unbelievable, it almost feels fake. Aryan, what the hell is up with you? For those of you who can't see Aryan, those of you listening only on audio, he's wearing a pair of AirPod Maxes on his head as we record this episode.
Were you talking to me?
What is going on?
Aishwarya, Apple sent these and it's the best feature because it cancels out your voice and I can't hear you. And my life is just so much better now. These newer AirPod Maxes have the best noise cancelling. And I'm not saying this because they sent it to us. It legitimately has amazing noise cancelling that's made my, workouts and everything 10x better.
He's been wearing them every single day since they sent them over. I got a pair too and they're absolutely incredible. And Aryan, aside from, I think, obviously the noise cancellation, the incredible new battery life, the much louder audio, my favorite feature is the fact that now no one can hear my music when they're standing really close to me outside, which was a feature in the older AirPods and it was kind of like a weird invasion of privacy.
I think it's a feature that helps the people around you to not indulge themselves into your horrible taste in music. But yeah, if you, go get these if you can because I love them and they have this new... The best, okay, my favorite thing before we get on, we need to edit our episodes and listen to our voice over and over again, which is not a fun part of this job, trust me. You can get bored of listening to your voice. Yeah. But it has a 3.5mm audio cable that you can connect. So no latency then, and which was a feature in wireless earphones that's usually not there. Yeah. So yeah, I love that and love this. But if you're listening on these AirPod Maxes or on any other device, what story are we going to listen to today? An
insane story, Aryan, from pre-independent India, 1933.
My favorite kinds,
yes. And just diabolical in nature is the only word I can use to describe it. For the Pandey family of Pakur, one of the wealthiest zamindari estates in the Bengal presidency, train stations were a familiar blur. Their lives moved between ancestral homes and city estates, courtrooms and royal visits, always with a small entourage and a sense of inherited importance. On November 26, 1933, 20-year-old Amarendra Chandra Pandey, the younger heir to the estate, arrived at Howrah station in Calcutta with his sister Banabala, his cousin Amina, and a few close family members. They were heading back home to Pakur after a short stay in the city, and they were surprised to say the least when Amarendra's half-brother, 30-year-old Binoyendra Chandra Pandey, showed up to see them off. The two shared blood, a family fortune, and a growing hostility that everyone around them knew was heading somewhere dark. But there he was, smiling, polite, even affectionate. No one quite knew what to make of it, but the family took the gesture to mean a small, maybe even unimportant peace offering. Moments later, as the family pushed through the crowds towards their train, walking past the hordes that found themselves on this famous and busy station, Amarendra flinched. "Someone pricked me," he said, turning towards a faceless figure already swallowed by the crowd. He rolled up his sleeve and pointed to a clean puncture mark just above his elbow. A faint stain was visible on the cuff of his shirt. Looking at the worsening bruise, Amarendra's sister's face turned to worry. So much worry, in fact, that she urged him to skip the train and to get it checked at a local hospital instead. But Binoyendra, calm and dismissive, told him not to overreact. After all, they were warriors by blood, and warriors didn't flinch at pinpricks. Amarendra agreed. The train must be boarded. Despite the unease of that prick, Amarendra was on his train seat moments later with his family in tow. But by the time that train pulled into Pakur, something was already wrong. Amarendra looked pale. He said he felt fine, but his voice had that tightness, the kind you hear when someone's trying not to worry the room. Within hours, by the time the family were back home in their estate, the fever began. His right arm, the one with the puncture, had now swollen so grotesquely it was hard to look at with a straight face. His heartbeat became erratic, his blood pressure dropped. A local doctor tried what he could, but it was clear this wasn't something they could handle in the remote estate's sick room. So 3 days after he left Calcutta, Amarendra was back to the city. This time not as a young aristocrat heading home, but as a rapidly deteriorating patient. What none of them knew then was that Amarendra's blood was already a battleground, his organs failing, his body collapsing under the weight of something few doctors in Calcutta had seen in years. Amarendra Chandra Pandey was dying, and no one could figure out why. At just 20 years old, Amarendra Chandra Pandey was already carrying the legacy of one of eastern India's richest zamindari families. He was the younger heir to the Pakur Raj estate, a sprawling dominion in what is now Jharkhand, and along with his half-brother Binoyendra Chandra Pandey, had inherited the family's fortune after their father's demise in 1929. At the time, Amarendra was still a minor, so Binoyendra, older by 10 years, became the de facto head of the estate. But things began to shift in 1931 when Amarendra turned 18 and started asserting his rights. By 1932, he was openly challenging Binoyendra's control, filing legal documents, seeking his share of the wealth, and even pushing for a formal partition of the property. If Amarendra was the quiet, well-liked younger heir, then Binoyendra was the storm that never quite passed. He was known among family members not just for his position as Karta of the estate, Karta referring to the guardian, a position usually reserved for the oldest male member of a family, but also for his habits that over time became harder to ignore. He lived extravagantly, spent freely, and cultivated a reputation for indulgence. Among his many frivolous relationships, the one relationship that drew the most criticism from the family was with a dancing girl named Balika Bala, whose growing influence over him made relatives like Rani Surjabati, the brother's aunt, deeply uneasy and antsy. But more than his personal life, what pushed the family to a breaking point was how he managed the estate's wealth. Even as the head of one of the richest zamindaris in Bengal, he failed to provide Amarendra with basic funds for education or upkeep. To relatives like Surjabati and cousins like Rabindranath and Baidyanath, this wasn't just bad management, it was betrayal. By the time 1932 rolled around, Amarendra had had enough. It had been 3 years since their father's passing, 3 years in which his older half-brother Binoyendra had controlled every part of the estate, every rupee, every signature. And for 3 years, Amarendra had waited patiently, giving his brother the benefit of doubt. But the promises never came through. Not the education he was owed, not the allowance needed to manage his day-to-day life, nothing. So in May of that year, shortly after returning from Deogarh, Amarendra did something that up until then had only been whispered about. He went to a lawyer. And with the help of relatives Rabindranath and Baidyanath and under the guidance of their powerful aunt Rani Surjabati, Amarendra executed a separate power of attorney, one that would remove his affairs from Binoyendra's control entirely. For a moment, it looked like Amarendra was preparing to take control of his life. But not long after the document was signed, things took a darker turn. Family members later testified that Binoyendra began pressuring Amarendra to revoke the power of attorney, not through calm discussion, but through what they described as a mix of threats and promises. He dangled the possibility of peace, told Amarendra he could still be taken care of, that all of this, the lawyers, the signatures, the fighting, could go away. Amarendra was young, barely 20, and despite everything, still wanted to believe his brother wasn't his enemy.
Aishwarya, does Amarendra aspire to be something other than a boy who inherits, big wealth, or is that the destiny he sees for himself?
I think that is the destiny. We don't have clear accounts of that, but clearly he wanted a share of this, right? He wasn't quite as passionate and wanting to take control over the land as much as Binoyendra was, but clearly he wanted to do his share in taking care of what was supposed to be his family's estate,
correct,
also his father's, and now supposed to be
because
his.
sometimes in zamindar families we see that there happens to be this one kid that wants to go to Britain and wants to be a barrister or something. if he didn't want any of that, then he definitely wants the land. I don't think any false promise of, I'll take care of you, I'll give you pocket money will suffice.
Yeah, no, it won't. So after incessant demands from Binoendra, on July 6th, just 2 months later, Amarendra folded. He cancelled the power of attorney. But from that moment on, it became clear to those around him that the two brothers were now living on opposite sides of a line that couldn't be erased. Because you see, even after Amarendra backed down from the power of attorney, it was clear that Binoendra hadn't let go of the fight. If anything, his actions over the next year became sharper, more deliberate. In November 1932, Binoendra began quietly moving money, trying to withdraw 13,000 rupees from Allahabad and other banks where the family had accounts. And just for reference, 13,000 rupees in 1932 is almost 4 crore rupees today. These weren't just personal funds, they were deposits tied to the joint estate. To make that possible, he applied for and received a succession certificate in June 1933, giving him and Amarendra joint authority to collect debts on behalf of the family. But what Binoendra didn't count on was that Amarendra would eventually find out. And when he did, he wasn't quiet about it. He started seeking legal advice again, this time more forcefully, even going as far as filing an objection when Binoendra tried to withdraw another 17,000 rupees from a compromise decree deposited at the Pakur court that October. The petition worked. The withdrawal was blocked. By the fall of 1933, the dynamic between the brothers had shifted into open hostility, and the rest of the family saw it clearly. Rani Surjabati, the aunt who had helped raise Amarendra after their father's death, had long distrusted Binoendra, but now even those who had urged patience were beginning to worry. And Amarendra shared their worry. He wasn't just resisting anymore, he was actively building a case. And as he began speaking more openly about partitioning the estate, people in the family started to fear that Binoendra might retaliate in ways no one could predict. Amarendra himself was cautious. He didn't eat food prepared by strangers. He stayed mostly within his close circle of relatives. But as one of his cousins later put it, the atmosphere in the family was tense, not with shouting or threats, but with silence, distance, and a growing sense that something wasn't right. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, Amarendra got a telegram. It was from Surjabati asking him to return to Calcutta. But when Amarendra showed it to his aunt, she was stunned. She had sent no such message. What they didn't know at the time was that Binoendra had forged the telegram himself. He had tried to convince Surjabati in person to summon Amarendra back to the city, but when she refused, he sent the message anyway, using her name. And it worked. On November 19th, 1933, Amarendra boarded a train to Calcutta.
Can you just do that with telegrams where you can... I don't know how telegrams...
Yeah, I have no idea
People
how telegrams
sometimes
work.
accuse us of being too young on this podcast, but I don't think any
Not
of you
of
are
being
old
too
enough
young.
for...
Of like hating on older people or pretending
No,
like
no,
we
no.
don't
Sometimes they're like,
understand.
oh, you don't know this 80s case. Oh my God, we talk
Oh,
about it in the
really?
family all the time. I read the comments more than her, clearly. But the point being that I have no idea how Telegram works.
Yeah, me neither.
Like you get a... Okay, we'll
Someone
pop
explain.
up here.
Is carrier pigeon bringing letters?
Don't do that. We'll get... Look at these Gen Z kids. No,
Just tell us
no,
in the
we honestly,
comments. We
tell us in the
appreciate
comments,
it.
yeah.
Even though he knew the telegram wasn't from his aunt, Amarendra went on November 19th, 1933. The brothers met in person again soon after and once again tried to discuss the division of property. But nothing changed. Amarendra insisted the settlement be done at Pakur, where he felt safer, and Binoendra, by all accounts, who remained outwardly cordial, persisted about keeping things in Calcutta. Both men viewed each other as a threat, with walls up and guards drawn. But to those who knew Amarendra personally, the idea that he could ever be a threat felt almost absurd. He wasn't loud, he wasn't combative. He was thoughtful, reserved, and often described as gentle, the kind of person who looked for solutions quietly before ever raising his voice. Those who worked with him or saw him move through the estate after his father's death remembered him as someone respectful, principled, and committed to doing right by his family name. He was known to be serious about his education, athletic by habit, and deeply loyal to the relatives who had supported him, especially Surjabati and his cousin Rabindra. The court records, in fact, show very little evidence of rage or revenge from Amarendra's side. Instead, they paint a picture of a young man simply trying to protect his future from someone who'd made a habit of burning bridges. It wasn't that Amarendra was perfect. It was that he was, by all accounts, reasonable. And that made what happened to him all the more heartbreaking. The first real scare came in the quiet hill town of Deogarh, where Amarendra had gone to spend the puja vacation. He was staying with his aunt, Rani Surjabati, at her home when Binoendra showed up, unannounced. With him was a man the family didn't know, someone he introduced only as a compounder. A short man, quiet, unfamiliar to the rest of the family. The visit was awkward but not dramatic. The brothers even went out for a walk together that day. Nothing major happened, nothing alarming, not then. But a few days after Binoyendra left, Amarendra fell ill. Violently ill. His symptoms escalated quickly, and the local physician, Dr. Surendranath Mukherjee, diagnosed it as tetanus. Tetanus wasn't uncommon, but this case didn't sit right with anyone. Amarendra had no obvious injury, no cut, no wound, just a slow, painful decline marked by spasms and a fever. Dr. Surendra began treatment immediately, administering anti-tetanus serum, the standard protocol. But then something strange happened. When Amarendra had fallen sick, a telegram had previously been sent to Binoyendra at Pakur, asking him to send the family physician just as an extra helping hand to Dr. Surendra. But instead, Binoyendra arrived with someone else, a man named Taranath Bhattacharya. Binoyendra insisted that Dr. Surendra, the man treating Amarendra, keep Taranath as an assistant. But Dr. Surendra declined, later testifying that Taranath kept pushing him to abandon serum treatment and switch to morphia instead.
Wow.
He found it suspicious and refused. A few days later, Binoyendra returned again, this time with Dr. Durga Ratan Dhar. Dr. Dhar convinced Dr. Surendra to try a different serum he had brought from Calcutta. But shortly after that was administered, Amarendra developed a painful abscess at the injection site. The infection worsened. More doctors followed. At one point, even a professor from Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine arrived and prescribed new medications. But by then, the family's trust was gone. They never gave Amarendra those prescriptions. Eventually, the infection led to a sinus that had to be surgically opened in Calcutta by yet another doctor, Dr. L.M. Banerjee. Amarendra would survive, but with a weakened heart and compromised health that never fully recovered. The compounder that Binoyendra had arrived with right before the tetanus attack faded in people's memory. He had come and gone like a shadow, but many would later wonder who this foreign man was. And then came November 26, 1933. The platforms at Howrah station were packed, shoulder to shoulder, smoke curling from engines, the echo of announcements bouncing off the iron beams overhead. It was just past noon when the Pandey family arrived. Amarendra, his aunt Rani Surjabati, his cousin Banabala, and their cousin Anima. They were heading back to Pakur after what had been a tense visit in Calcutta. Amarendra had spent days negotiating with Binoyendra, trying and failing to get traction on dividing the estate. The meetings had gone nowhere, and by this point everyone in the family just wanted to get home. So when they saw Binoyendra standing at the station entrance, smiling, waiting to see them off, it took the whole group by surprise. As relatives later testified, it wasn't just unexpected, it was off-brand. He didn't do things like this. Binoyendra wasn't known for his sentimentality or goodbyes. And yet there he was, overly warm, chatting easily with Amarendra, insisting on escorting them to the platform. No one said anything in the moment, but several later admitted that the whole thing felt odd. The family moved through the ticket check with Amarendra at the front, followed by his aunt and sisters. Binoyendra lingered at the rear, talking to an attendant. As they entered the station hall, a wide corridor filled with travellers and porters yelling over luggage, Amarendra suddenly stiffened. A short man in khadi had just pressed up against him from the opposite direction, brushing up hard enough to make him stop. Amarendra touched his right arm, just above the elbow. "Someone pricked me," he said quietly. He rolled up his sleeve and showed the others. There was a single puncture mark, small but clean, and a thin, colourless fluid had stained his shirt cuff. It was the kind of thing that could be nothing, or not. Kamla Prasad Pandey, Amarendra's cousin, and his sister Banabala were immediately alarmed. So was Ashok Prakash Mitra, a close friend. They urged him not to board the train, to stay back in Calcutta and see a doctor. But Binoyendra waved them off. "You're overreacting," he said, brushing aside their concern. Amarendra hesitated, but he wasn't feeling unwell. Not yet. And with Binoyendra pushing and the family unsure what to make of it, Amarendra made the choice to go. He stepped onto the train. Within hours, he would begin to feel the first signs that something was deeply wrong.
I think, in any other situation, I would say that it was obvious with the building tension that he should have gone to the hospital, especially with the previous injection mark leading to that infection and ultimately sinus.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what Binoyendra did smartly or tactfully is appeal to that warrior ego that you mentioned initially.
Absolutely.
And he was surrounded, Amarendra was surrounded by so many family and friends that when you challenge his warrior ego, and anyway these two brothers are in a status fight, you will succumb to that. You will say, hey, yeah, I'm a warrior.
I can do this. And he wasn't even feeling that sick at that point. I also think how small is a brush against someone at a train station, right? Obviously, it's odd that you have the prick and then there is also something on your shirt. But how small a moment, how minuscule a moment is a brush up against someone where you feel something on a station. So I completely get where he came from, where he didn't decide to stay back in Calcutta.
I don't know what the particular bioweapon used was, but one thing that really scares me from the stories I've heard are about the AIDS pricks that were done in the theaters.
In PVRs,
and I think that was an urban legend. I'm not sure.
Oh, I don't know.
But because of that, a prick does stand out to me as something big. But I'm guessing nobody cared about that in 1933.
Also, is it a prick? Is it not a prick? You just brushed up with someone. It felt kind of a little tingly. By the time Amarendra reached Pakur, things got worse. At first, the family thought it might be a simple infection. They brought in local physicians, tried tests, fluids, but nothing worked. The swelling worsened, spreading from his upper arm to his shoulder. He started experiencing chills, lightheadedness, and waves of nausea. Within 48 hours, it was clear that whatever was happening wasn't routine. And then came the letter. Kamla Prasad, who had been present at the Howrah station and hadn't been able to stop thinking about how odd this encounter was, wrote urgently from Calcutta, urging the family to bring Amarendra back to the city immediately. That same advice came from Rabindranath Pandey, another trusted cousin who had long been Amarendra's supporter. They didn't trust the medical care in Pakur. They wanted him near real hospitals. And more importantly, they didn't trust the situation, not with what had happened at the station. Amarendra agreed. With Rabindra by his side, he boarded the return train to Calcutta on November 29th. Back in Calcutta, Amarendra was taken to the family's guest house in Rajbihari, where Dr. Nalini Ranjan Sengupta, one of the city's most respected physicians, was called in for a house call. The swelling in Amarendra's right arm had gotten worse. His fever was high at 105 degrees. His blood pressure dangerously low. When Dr. Sengupta examined the site, he noticed a distinct mark just above the deltoid, clean, small, and unmistakably like that of a hypodermic needle. He immediately suspected something more serious and recommended a blood culture without delay. The sample was collected by Dr. Santosh Kumar Gupta, a specialist at the School of Tropical Medicine. But while they waited for results, Amarendra's condition rapidly declined. His entire arm was inflamed. His heart rate was irregular. He was hallucinating. By December 3rd, he had slipped into a coma. The following morning, on December 4th, 1933, Amarendra Chandra Pandey died. The death certificate was issued quickly, too quickly according to the family. It listed septic pneumonia as the cause. The body was cremated within hours at the Kalighat crematorium, organized in part by Binoyendra, who once again had reinserted himself into the family's inner circle. It wasn't until days later that the blood culture results came in. Dr. Gupta's tests had revealed the presence of something terrifying, a bacterium named Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for the bubonic plague.
No way.
Yeah, oh my God. I can't even tell you, when I learned this detail, my mind was just... And bubonic plague in 1933, we'll get to what that means, but what it means today, that's just...
Aishwarya, and we've covered bioweapon attacks before, but we've had the run-of-the-mill anthrax or cyanide.
Yeah, not this.
Using plague to kill somebody in the 20th century is insane.
This discovery, like to Howrah unto everyone, was so unbelievable that to confirm their findings, they inoculated the sample into a white rat. The rat died, the postmortem confirmed the same bacteria. In that moment, all the theories, all the doubts, all the quiet suspicions hardened into something terrifyingly real. Amarendra hadn't died of pneumonia. He had been deliberately infected with one of the deadliest diseases known to man. One estimated to have killed 50 million people in Europe, which was almost 60% of Europe's population in the 14th century. It marked one of the darkest periods of human history, and Amarendra, a man only demanding for what was rightfully his, had died a painful death at the hands of the same agent. Even with the lab results in hand though, even with the confirmation that Amarendra had died of plague, the family didn't go to the police right away. In fact, for weeks they didn't go at all. There was fear, of course, but it wasn't fear of the truth. It was fear of the fallout. The Pakur Zamindari wasn't just a family estate. It was a name, a reputation, a legacy. Public scandal could taint everything. And accusing one of their own, especially someone as publicly visible as Binoyendra, risked exposing not just a crime, but the rot beneath a respected aristocratic lineage. Still, the doubts grew louder. People in the family were talking, not just to each other, but to lawyers. one name kept coming up, Kalidas Gupta, a long-time family advisor who had known Amarendra well. He listened, he asked questions, and eventually he encouraged them to take a step no one had been ready for. On January 22nd, 1934, 2 months after that day at Howrah station, Amarendra's cousin Kamla Prasad Pandey filed a formal petition with the Deputy Commissioner of Police in Calcutta. That same week, a separate complaint was lodged at the Tollygunj police station, naming Binoyendra as a suspect. The case was handed over to Sub-Inspector Sarat Chandra Mitra of the Bengal Intelligence Service, and with that, the investigation officially began. And right from the get-go, 2 names landed on the officers' desks almost immediately. One was, of course, of Binoyendra, and the other was of Taranath Bhattacharya, the man who had quietly hovered at the edges of the family from the beginning. Taranath is the man that Binoyendra kept bringing with him every time Amarendra fell sick, telling the family that he was a qualified doctor who could treat him. If you remember, this is the same man he tried to get Dr. Surendra to hire as an assistant after Amarendra had contracted tetanus the year prior. Up until this point, Taranath had been referred to only as a doctor, but that label didn't hold up under scrutiny. He wasn't licensed. He had no formal degree. He was, in reality, a laboratory assistant at Calcutta Medical Supply Concern. What he did have, however, was just enough technical knowledge and just enough ambition to turn science into a weapon. The more the police dug into his background, the more disturbing the picture became. He had a habit of attaching the letters DMT, Diploma in Tropical Medicine, after his name, though he held no such qualification. He was obsessed with bacteria, and long before Amarendra's murder, he had been trying to get his hands on live plague cultures. Investigators soon uncovered the paper trail, telegrams, hotel ledgers, letters of introduction. A guide in Mumbai named Ratan Salaria identified both men, Binoyendra and Taranath, as having travelled together to Mumbai that July, mere months before the murder. The men weren't there for business, or to meet family, or any ordinary reason. They had checked into the Seaview Hotel, falsely listing their address as Tagore Castle Lane in Calcutta. There, they hired local guide Ratan Salaria and began making inquiries with alarming precision. First at the Hafkind Institute and then at the Arthur Road Infectious Disease Hospital, one of the few places in India that handle live plague cultures. These centers, especially the Hafkind Institute in Mumbai, was at the frontier of disease research in British India, ironically named after Dr. Valdemar Hafkind, the Russian-French bacteriologist who was the first one to build a vaccine against the bubonic plague. Modern medicine was being introduced alongside colonial administration at these institutes. It was supposed to be about healing, control, progress. Science was a symbol of both power and possibility. But in this case, the science being pioneered at these institutes was going to be used for devastation. There, Binoyendra convinced hospital officials to allow his doctor friend that he was travelling with, Taranath Bhattacharya, to access their laboratory. He even arranged for a tube of live plague bacteria to be supplied for what was claimed to be experimental work by offering bribes and pushing boundaries. Rats were purchased from the market and tests were staged. For 5 days, the man he brought with him worked freely inside the hospital lab, often unsupervised. And then, on the 5th night, both men disappeared. No notice, no follow-up, no returned materials. Just an unfinished experiment and a plague culture that was never accounted for again. It was this testimony by Salaria, along with the cooperation of several doctors in Mumbai, that ultimately confirmed it. These men hadn't been studying the plague, they had been harvesting it. As investigators traced the steps that led to Amarendra's murder, more pieces began to fall into place. One was financial, and it wasn't subtle. While in Mumbai in 1933, around the same time he and Taranath were negotiating for plague culture, Binoyendra had attempted to insure Amarendra's life for 51,000 rupees in 1993 money. 51,000 rupees for life insurance was an unusually large policy for the time, and in today's money is around 25 crore rupees. And what stood out even more was a clause he had tried to include in it. The policy was not to be contested after Amarendra's death. The company refused, but the attempt, made months before Amarendra was killed, spoke volumes. Then there were the physical details. Witnesses from Howrah station recalled Amarendra's exact words after the prick. "Someone has pricked me." His shirt cuff, later examined by family members. Dr. Nalini Ranjan Sengupta, the physician who saw him days later, confirmed that the mark on his arm resembled a puncture of a hypodermic needle and not the kind caused by an insect or an accidental scratch. Dr. Santosh Gupta's lab results, the successful plague culture grown from Amarendra's body and the rat subsequently killed with it, would all be entered as hard evidence into the forensic lab. With all of this information meticulously gathered, on February 16, 1934, less than a month after the complaint was filed, based on accounts of family and friends and eyewitness testimony and details of monetary affairs of the family, Amarendra Chandra Pandey was arrested while attempting to board a train to Mumbai. The police already suspected he was trying to flee, and within the next 48 hours, a second arrest was made of Taranath Bhattacharya. Taranath, during his initial questioning, denied ever going to Mumbai or knowing Amarendra at all. Later, while out on bail, he changed his story and admitted to the trip, but now claimed they had gone separately. He also implied that whatever he had done, others had done more. Quote, "What little I have done, those who have done more have not been arrested." End quote. Amarendra, on the other hand, denied any knowledge of the station incident, claimed the case was fabricated by relatives out to ruin him, and said his visits to Mumbai were purely for business related to the film industry, though there was no account of such business being conducted while he was there. In any case, there was no explanation that could have saved the men their fate, which came to them in 1935, the year the trial against them began. From the very start, it drew national and international attention, even back in the 1930s. Newspapers from Calcutta to Singapore followed the case with fascination, dubbing it everything from the plague needle murder to murder with germs. The prosecution's case was entirely circumstantial, but it was airtight. Over 9 months, they laid it all out: the financial motive, the failed tetanus attempt, the forged telegram, the suspicious station behavior, the Mumbai trail, the procurement of plague culture, the rat experiments, and the consistent efforts by both men to evade or mislead investigators. The forensic evidence became the cornerstone: the blood culture, the rat tests, the microscopic slides reportedly examined by court judges themselves. Dr. Santosh Gupta testified to the lab findings. Captain Pasricha from the School of Tropical Medicine verified that the pathogen could not have come from any natural source in Calcutta. It had to have been transported from elsewhere. The Arthur Road Hospital in Mumbai, they argued, was the only viable source, where eyewitnesses confirmed the men's presence. The defense tried to suggest that Amarendra had contracted plague naturally, possibly from a flea bite or through causal contact. But the prosecution shut that down. There hadn't been a single confirmed case of plague in Calcutta in 3 years leading up to Amarendra's death.
It's like somebody 50 years from now being infected with COVID and the prosecution are arguing a bat bit him. Yeah, bat.
Yeah, literally like that.
Doesn't make sense,
No,
guys.
I agree.
Come on. I think the argument could have been better if they were like, no, it was, just either pinning it on Taranath or something.
Sure.
But fleas in like
yeah, and the first case in 3 years in the whole state. Yeah,
make
no.
sense. Wait, first case in 3 years? Oh, so the plague was still something that was
Something, but
ravishing
not
people?
common at all. Like even 3 years ago, it's not that there were many cases. It was not common by any standard.
Got it.
Defense also tried to claim that the culture collected by the doctors might have been contaminated or mishandled after it was taken from Amarendra's body, meaning that the plague entered the sample after the sample was withdrawn. Again, experts pushed back. The procedures used were standard, the bacterial strain was visible, and the clinical symptoms Amarendra experienced aligned precisely with plague infection. In the end, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty. Both Amarendra and Taranath were sentenced to death. But in January 1936, the Calcutta High Court reviewed the case on appeal. While the judges agreed with the conviction, they noted the entire case rested on circumstantial evidence alone, and that the identity of the person who actually injected Amarendra still remained unknown. In a striking decision, they commuted the sentence to life imprisonment. Still, the words of Justice Lord Williams, who presided over the case, stayed with everyone. This case is probably unique in the annals of crime. Media across the world agreed. A 1935 Time magazine article described the case as, quote, unparalleled in the annals of crime in India in its enormity, well-planned scientific design, and diabolical ingenuity, end quote. After the conviction, both Amarendra and Taranath were sent to the cellular jail in Andaman Island, or Kalapani, a fate reserved for the most serious offenders under British rule. There is no record of what Taranath's life inside was like, but years later, accounts would surface claiming he went mad during his sentence. Amarendras' story, though, didn't end behind bars. In 1947, when India gained independence, the new government issued a sweeping general amnesty.
Wow.
Thousands of prisoners were released, political and criminal alike, and among them was Amarendra. After 13 years in prison, he walked free. He returned to Pakur, where the estate he had once fought to control had fractured beyond recognition. The estate was divided, the family distanced, and his presence stirred only unease. But he didn't come back quietly. According to family accounts and later police records, Binoyendra showed signs of severe mental decline. He grew paranoid. He became obsessed with the people who had testified against him. One by one, he began threatening them, sometimes publicly, sometimes in writing. Relatives said he spoke in circles, ranted about betrayal, paced the halls of the Haveli, muttering names from the past. The situation was escalating as Binoyendra descended into madness within the walls of the same compound he had ruined his life to gain. The police were notified more than once, but for a while, nothing happened. Then one day, something shifted. Binoyendra barricaded himself inside the old family Haveli, a sprawling structure with thick stone walls and a history that now felt haunted. He had a firearm, stolen or smuggled, no one knows, but he refused to come out. When police arrived, he shouted threats through a closed door, warning that if anyone entered, he would shoot. By that point, neighbors had gathered outside, a silent crowd standing just beyond the estate walls. No one moved. Inside, officers tried to negotiate, but Binoyendra wouldn't listen. At some point during the standoff, a shot rang out from inside the house. Maybe a warning, maybe something else. That was the moment the police decided to force entry. They breached the Haveli's front corridor, and what followed was brief but violent. Gunfire was exchanged. No one could say how many rounds. But when it ended, Amarendra Chandra Pandey was found dead, still inside the room where he had been hiding. The man who had once orchestrated one of the most calculated murders in Indian legal history died not in silence, but in chaos, surrounded by echoes of the very violence he once thought he could control. As for Taranath, his name faded into obscurity. He died quietly somewhere, possibly still incarcerated, possibly not. The man who had wielded microbes like a murder weapon was no more. Like most zamindaris, the Pakur zamindari too dissolved quietly after India abolished the feudal landholding system in 1950. The titles vanished, the power shifted, and whatever was left of the Pandey family, their wealth, their influence, their fear, faded with it. There is little public record of where the descendants are now. No memoirs, no interviews, just traces. A few family homes still standing in Pakur. A surname that shows up occasionally on voter lists. A memory mostly. But the legacy of that name and the crime that tore it apart still lingers in legal textbooks, in rare newspaper archives, in footnotes of India's judicial history. It's a story that outlived the family who tried to bury it. It has now been nearly a century since Amarendra Chandra Pandey walked through Howrah station and felt that single deliberate prick in the arm. The man who did it was never caught. The syringe was never found. The weapon, a culture of plague bacteria, has long vanished from the world. But what stayed behind is something harder to name. Because this wasn't just a murder. This wasn't just a conspiracy. It was a story about entitlement, about power, and about what happens when family fractures, when science becomes a tool for vengeance, when a life is reduced to an obstacle in the way of inheritance. Amarendra wasn't a revolutionary or a public figure. He didn't die making a grand statement. He was just a young man, quiet, serious, careful, who trusted his family a little longer than he should have. And in the end, it wasn't the estate, the money, or even the law that defined his story. It was a single moment in a crowd, on a platform in Calcutta, that changed everything. If you like what we do here at Desi Studios and absolutely love what we're wearing today, this is merch you can go buy all for yourself.
You can buy this Desi Crime merch in our YouTube store on the link down below at Kadak Merch. Keep the engines at Desi Studios rolling so we can pay our videographer right behind the camera to make these amazing episodes just for you.